Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Striation 6 podcast. I am your host, Sam Chada. I'm the owner of Striation 6, and I'm bringing you this podcast as I do with everything I do in the profession of exercise to help you feel, function, look, and live better through exercise. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope this is a great episode for you. This is part two of our exercise versus series. And what we're doing today is comparing exercise as it was laid out in part one of this series versus activity and play. And just as a reminder of the intention of this series, what I'm trying to do here for people who are listening is create a thoughtful framework for what exercise is to help to create, excuse me, to help create insight as to why what you see in your own effort as exercise might not be working for you as desired. So if you are thinking about this properly, you can hopefully see some holes in how you might be approaching your exercise process. Maybe what you see as exercise in this case, I'm not sure, is something more along the lines of activity and play. And maybe by changing certain things, you can keep all the benefits of some activity and some play in various places in your life, but channel your efforts towards more meaningful and intentional exercise in order to really get what you want out of your body, get yourself progressing and feeling, functioning, looking, and living the way you desire. So, what I'd like to do today is review my view. This is in no way an objective definition of exercise. This is definitely a view of exercise from my brain here as I've been honing it over my 20 some odd years, 20 plus years as an exercise professional, learning from some excellent minds from a bunch of different perspectives. This is something that I've put together and I hope it's helpful for you. So, from a review, just a basic review of episode one, I view exercise and I invite you to potentially view exercise as a deliberate, voluntary, and primarily physical effort on the part of an individual with a particular intention to cause or prevent a specific movement or series of movements in a specific manner or orchestration in the body of that individual against an also specifically applied resistance in a sufficient amount with the aim of improving a given number of bodily functions and therein producing better health in the individual, including but not limited to muscular output, muscle growth, active available joint mobility, movement orchestration under specific conditions, and cardiorespiratory function that is divorced to the greatest extent possible from the performance of outcomes, tasks, and events that would or could occur, outside of the body of the individual. I know it's a mouthful, and I went over this in great detail in episode one. Episode one is less than 20 minutes. So if you haven't tuned into it yet or need a review and you're engaged in this and finding it in any way helpful, please go back and listen to episode one. It's the episode right before this one. What I'd like to do now is outline how I see my view on activity and play, their benefits, and how they might differ from exercise based on how I've set it out here. Okay. And the reason I wanted to address this first is I find these are potentially the most common types of physical effort. They're certainly the most low intensity types of physical effort on the list of others to cover, but they're probably the most common types of physical effort that I am told or I see categorized as exercise that doesn't quite fit the view of exercise that I have. And I hope you see what I mean here. I hope it opens things up a bit for you, or if it doesn't open things up a bit for you, you think, oh, I'm on point with this already. My exercise is going well. But, my dad, he could really use this point of view. He could really, see what these potential contrasts are, maybe change things in how he exercises, or maybe ask some good questions about how to exercise better based on these definitions. So here we go. Stay with me here. So activity, as I see it, I'm going to lay out a definition here and then contrast it to my view of exercise. Activity is relatively low intensity physical effort for an indefinite period of time with undefined, unknown, distinctly low levels of resistance without any particularly internally oriented intentions, that may be affiliated with the performance of a particular external event or outcome, but without that event or outcome being tied to any process orientation, progression, or specific physical health outcome. Okay. So I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give some examples of activities or things that I see as activity that might fit the bill here. Okay, based on this view. So some examples of an activity might be going for a leisurely or social walk where you are not paying particular attention to pace, time, or the number of stops to check out sites along the way, or playing catch like with a baseball or a football while chatting with a friend, a child, or a relative. So I think hopefully those specific examples paint a more vivid picture of what I'm intending to describe here. So now to compare and contrast those things, or excuse me, that view of activity with how I see exercise. In the beginning of this view, we've got relatively low intensity physical effort for an indefinite period of time with undefined, unknown, distinctly low levels of resistance. So that already differs from exercise in some pretty specific ways. Our view of exercise had some pretty specific intentions involved in it with sufficient levels of resistance, sufficient levels of intensity, and defined parameters put in. So you've got this kind of wavering, kind of undefined physical thing compared to exercise as a very defined uh, physical thing with lots of specific parameters put in place when it comes to the effort and the resistance applied to that effort. Okay. Without any particularly, or excuse me, without any particular internally oriented intentions, right away we can see a big difference there. Exercise has health benefits, internally oriented health benefits and intentions implied with it in our view. And then lastly, that may be affiliated with the performance of a particular external event or outcome, but without that event or outcome being tied to any process orientation, progression, or specific physical health outcome. So basically, there's nothing there's nothing intentionally happening here. Okay, there's no aspiration intentionally being pursued here. You're just kind of going for a walk. You're not trying to work on your cardiorespiratory fitness. You're just kind of playing catch. You're not trying to, improve your shoulder strength through throwing. You're not trying to do anything except engage in this game of catch, this casual game of catch, which is of a very low intensity social nature. All right. Now I'm going to come back to all that stuff. The last thing I want anyone to think as I'm going through these definitions is that I think that these things are bad. The things I've described here as activity are almost certainly good. They involve social engagement, bonding with loved ones. We're going to come back to this, but I wanted to just put that in there before I got into the definition or the view that I have of play, because as I see it, play and activity are very important. They're just not exercise. All right. So play, thought about this for a little bit. So play, I see as low or moderate intensity physical effort for an indefinite amount of time with undefined low or moderate levels of resistance that follows a particular set of rules that tend to be of a general nature and where participants understand that while they are bound by those rules in the constitution of the endeavor, that the nature of the engagement is casual and rules may change as long as there's sufficient as long as there's sufficient agreement amongst participants that is tied to the performance of external outcomes and events and is wholly divorced from the process of any progressive physical health in the body. Okay, so some examples of play might include backyard basketball games, all right, that are not actual basketball. So something like 21, where you're not really dribbling or running or having to, create offense against a defender or a number of defenders. You're just kind of taking shots from the free throw line and maybe talking smack with whomever you're playing with. I used to play with my dad, and we used to talk a lot of smack to each other. It's one of the ways that he tried to mentally toughen me up when I was a kid. Horse is another game of a backyard basketball game that, you can do some fancy stuff with it, but it's not really exercise. It's not really practice. You're just kind of goofing off and having fun with a friend or a relative, a loved one. Um, Limitless games that parents or adult caregivers might play with young children. If you've ever played any game with a young kid, particularly a kid kind of under, I don't know, 6 or 5 years old, you know that one, rules are a thing, right? Kids understand rules. Kids also like to change rules as their imaginations run away with them. So here we have this sort of general rule set that is important for kids to try to understand, but one that can sort of shift because the nature of play versus competition, which we'll talk about in a future episode, is not so serious. It's not so stringent. And you know what? It shouldn't be, based on the benefits that play offers to people. Another example, and this is going to border on some other things that we'll talk about in later episodes, but I'm a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy. I tend to talk about it. I try not to talk about it too much. But if you're doing modified sort of lower intensity sparring or rolling in a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class, that's also play. It borders on what I like to categorize as practice. We'll talk about practice in the next part of this series. But I mean, if you've been in a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class, a serious or a competition Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class, they're not playing. Like, it's borderline competition. It's trying to mimic competition. Or if you have friends in class that you roll with on a regular basis and the agreement is we're getting after this, we're going hard, that's not play. That's very fairly serious. They're implied rule sets. People know what the rule sets are. They follow them very stringently and ethically, hopefully anyway. If you're doing modified lower intensity sparring or rolling, you're kind of playing more than anything else. You're kind of practicing, but you're sort of maybe letting a person get a one up on you, and then they let you get a one up on them. And, maybe one person's got a hand in their belt, so they can only use one arm. Like, there's all these different things that, yes, follow a rule set and it has to be agreed upon. And there are generalities at play, but no one's being too serious about it. No one's being too aggressive about it. Our systems aren't being pushed so hard. It's play as far as I'm concerned. It's as close to like wrestling around with your kids as you can get without it being your actual kids, with it being, another full grown adult. So those are some examples of play. You can see how play contrasts, in my view, with exercise. When we're talking about play, we're talking about external outcomes being the orientation. I'm trying to score a point. I'm trying to make a basket. I'm trying to get a tap, but I'm not trying to do it. If the last reference was to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu there, but I'm not trying to do it in any serious way. There isn't enough resistance. There isn't enough effort against resistance to really create any physical adaptations. There's lots of mental, cognitive, and emotional adaptations that can come from play. They're very, very, very important. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But this is really kind of low moderate. There are rules that have nothing to do with the processes of the body. There are more rules about things going on externally and interpersonally between yourself, your team, if it's a team thing, and the other player or players in the game with you. Okay, so not physically, not oriented at physical adaptation, nothing process oriented here, nothing specifically defined in terms of resistance or effort, and external oriented outcomes are the goal here versus internally oriented outcomes. So that's how play and activity differ from exercise for me. Now, before we go on to how engaging in those things might be hampering your exercise efforts, I would be remiss not to mention the numerous benefits of activity and play. Both activity and play are extremely important. Okay, they're extremely important to have in your life. It's just a question of amount and time and resource allocation to them that become the issue here in regards to you and your specific exercise related goals. All right. Activity and play are hugely important for connection with friends and loved ones. Bonding, particularly with kids, plays huge, 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 huge. Dads are more involved in kids' lives than ever before, and it seems to be through play that fathers and kids bond. And I'm talking from personal experience here as well as material that I've read. So play is hugely important when it comes to strengthening activity and play, I should say, is hugely important when it comes to strengthening relationships with friends, family, and loved ones. Okay. Passing on the spirit of play is a key way that humans are socialized. So just creating better humans through playing through playing good games is a great benefit of engaging in activity and play, particularly with activity, but potentially with play as well. There's exposure to the outdoors, which has numerous benefits. I live by an area in Toronto called the Beltline. It's considered a park. It's really more like a really long, sort of flat trail. It extends, I don't know how many kilometers. And if you're out there on a weekend from kind of 8 in the morning through to the end of the day, it is just packed with people walking and jogging. Some people are doing it more seriously, engaging potentially in exercise or training or practice, depending on the situation. Again, we'll talk more about that stuff in the next episode. Some people are just kind of being active. They're just out for a low key walk, and while that walk might not constitute exercise in the sense that it's insufficient to cause adaptations that exercise would cause, being out in nature, potentially being out in nature with a loved one, talking, breathing fresh air, being around trees, these are all hugely, hugely healthy. The problem with these things that I've talked about is they just might not be exercise. And the reasons potentially that your play and activity might not be helping you progress in your exercise, okay, include the following. And this is the last part of today's podcast. One, they're too undefined. All right. When we're talking about exercise, there must be an aim. Somebody says, I need to exercise. I'm going to go for a walk. All right. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I would rather you go for a walk than do nothing. Okay. Assuming the walk doesn't hurt you. And if you're out there thinking, how could a walk hurt someone? I've seen it. Assuming the walk doesn't hurt you, go for the walk. Absolutely go for the walk. And if you're coming off the couch and you're combining your walk with other healthy habits around sleep and food and water and mental health stuff, you might see some really great things happen from going for your walks. And then you might get stuck. You might think, I want to add some muscle to my frame. The walks aren't working for me anymore. What do I need to do now? Now, that's a very obvious and sort of stark contrast, but you can see how activity might run out pretty quickly. It might be general activity, low grade, low intensity activity, even if it's undefined. And even if it's just kind of like, I'm going to walk around the block a couple of times, there's nothing too specific about it. Might do you some benefit at first because you're going from nothing to something. But once the benefit of nothing to something runs out, it's going to run out quick. All right. Related to that, intensity and resistance are insufficient to stimulate adaptations. I mentioned a client in my last episode or in the last episode of this series that when I asked him what his wife does for exercise, just in casual conversation during a session one day, he said parenting. Now, I think when he said parenting, he included everything from playing with his kids to carrying them around the house to all the stuff that goes into parenting, making meals and being the at-home adult caregiver. She was probably cleaning, taking out a more active role in cleaning the house and preparing meals and doing grocery shopping and that kind of thing. That, depending on the person, might actually be sufficient to stimulate adaptations. If you're someone who's already in a certain level of physical condition because you exercised before having kids, or you just lived a sufficiently active life, the intensity and resistance associated with that activity or any other activity, including playing with your kids, might be insufficient to stimulate adaptation. So let's say we get out of the kind of domestic scene and now we're at the park with our kids. All right. And we're playing with our kids and we think to ourselves, oh, I was outside for a couple hours and my step count's reading like 12,000. And, that should be enough exercise. Yet I'm not achieving my goals. I'm not seeing what I want to see happening in my body. Okay, well, a lot of activity and a lot of low key play might just be a whole bunch of really insufficiently low grade stimulus to your system that leaves you tired and feeling kind of what's the word? Satisfied, hopefully from a mental health standpoint and from an emotional standpoint, that you've been outdoors and you've engaged with people and you've done a bunch of fun stuff, but that doesn't mean it's sufficiently resistant physically to cause the adaptations that you're looking for. So again, by being defined and intentional about what we're doing with our bodies, we could maybe zero in a bit more on the kinds of effort that would cause the changes that we want to see. All right. Now, as I go through this, I realize I'm talking a lot about people with kids. All right. The reason I'm using people with kids is because it's a very near and dear example to me. The last thing I want anyone to think when I'm talking about playing with kids and raising kids being insufficient levels of activity is that I'm criticizing adult caregivers of any gender or any age for being lazy or not being willing to do things outside of raising their kids. That's the last thing I'm talking about. People who stay at home with kids, take care of the kids, take care of the house, to me fulfill a hugely important role in society. All right. And a hugely important role in the lives of the children that they care for. When it comes to that person and their individual health and exercise related goals, I have a lot of sympathy for people who run out of time and energy to pay attention to those goals. And for all the people out there saying no excuses, get it done, that's great until you run out of time and energy because something's changed in your own world. So let's be clear here. Everyone has their own set of circumstances. And if you've run out of time for specifically intended exercise because you're caring for kids, it's something that I share a lot of empathy for. All right. And I hope that this is kind of conscientiousness raising. And then if you want to divert 5 minutes twice a week towards some intentionally directed exercise, it might be enough to get your system in whatever way you want to see it moving in the right direction. If it's not ready, if you're not ready for it right now, I totally understand. Just know simple solutions are available. Okay. Getting back to potential reasons why playing activity might not be helping you progress in your exercise process. So I've talked about things being insufficient to stimulate adaptation. Certain aspects of play might present too much resistance for an area of your body that's at a deficit. Okay. I talked about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu earlier, and depending on who's playing in a light bout of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu sparring or rolling or Endori, however you want to refer to it in your Jiu-Jitsu vernacular, rolling light might actually not be light. Okay. Rolling light, going light might be light for your cardiovascular system. It might be playful. So mentally it's light. But if you have a shoulder or a back that's sensitive, there may be no such thing as light rolling. And if you're a person with an injured area that's going into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or some other martial art or some other sport that where you have the option to be playful, to go light, you might think you're going light, but you might actually be going way too intense, way too heavy for a deficit area of your body. So the even though the activity or the play is low gear, for most of you, for some of you, it may be overwhelming. And if it's overwhelming for that area in sufficient quantity, it may set the whole system back. So while many of the issues I'm talking about present as this stuff is insufficient for the adaptations that you want to have occur in your body, it might actually be overly sufficient and set you back more depending on your individual settings in individual joints, muscles, and systems in your body. Okay. And then lastly, the level of physical output demanded from play and activity is irregular and potentially too inconsistent to be effective. So if we go back to people taking walks, and again, take your walks, get outside. Step count is fashionable these days. I think it's great. I think it's a great way to monitor your overall levels of output and activity, and particularly if you are looking to be consistent, steps are a great way of kind of making a game out of physical activity, to make sure that you get outdoors enough and whatever you're trying to do, burn a sufficient amount of calories, whatever it is. All right. Let's say you're a person who's going for a walk. All right. And let's say the walk is actually of a sufficient level of intensity for you for any number of reasons to actually cause some change in your system. Let's say it's actually sort of strenuous on your muscles. Let's say you actually get a decent enough heart rate elevation on it that if you did it for enough time, you might actually get some cardiorespiratory stimulus that's sufficient enough to maybe cause some adaptations. But you like window shopping or shopping, and or you're a photographer. Let's take it out of the shopping realm. You're a photographer and you bring your camera with you and you're going, and all of a sudden you see a bird that you want to photograph. So you stop for a few minutes or maybe quite a few minutes. Maybe you're waiting for the light of the sunset to hit a certain way. So you're kind of just standing around, and the output being demanded is just too inconsistent to be effective because the internal process, the internal health outcome is not your prime directive. You're more concerned about photos or stores or coffee shops or whatever it might be that has you distracted from what's happening on the inside. So hopefully this is a good comparison and contrast for you between something more along the lines of activity and play versus what I view as exercise. And I realize as I get into these talks, it might sound a little academic. What I'm hoping is that if even a little part of this podcast series get someone out there to think to themselves, yeah, you know what? I think I've maybe been misdirecting my physical effort, and I'm going to make one tiny change and see what happens. Then my job is done. So if that's you, I hope this was helpful. If it's not you, I hope it's helpful anyway, or maybe you could forward this to a person who might find it helpful, and that'd be a mitzvah. So thanks very much for listening. Please remember to leave a comment and leave us a rating from up to 5 stars. I will see you next week for part 3 of this series, exercise versus practice and training. That's going to be a big one, I hope. Have a great one.